Life itself is a miracle. The bodies of both humans and animals are extremely complex. To even begin to think that something as complex as a living body formed by mere accident is to consider the absurd. Complexity never comes from chaos. Complexity and order cannot come from random happenstance. To even think that something as intricate as the eye came together accidentally is to delude oneself. If there were no other arguments to refute the theory of evolution, the mystery of the DNA molecule would, in itself, be more than enough evidence to blow the whole theory to bits. Evolution says, first of all, that something came out of nothing, which is an impossibility, both according to true science as well as plain common sense. Secondly, to say that random matter somehow suddenly came together and formed something as complex as the human body is, again, to delude oneself. The DNA molecule is what determines how a body will be formed. It determines what kind of creature the being is, what it will look like, its temperament, basically anything that determines what that body will be. It is a set of instructions on how to build and form that particular creation. Now, just what is this mysterious molecule that provided all of your and my characteristics? This is information about DNA from Wikipedia. Deoxyribonucleic acid, or DNA, is a polymer composed of two polynucleotide chains that coil around each other to form a double helix. The polymer carries genetic instructions for the development, functioning, growth and reproduction of all known organisms and many viruses. DNA and ribonucleic acid, or RNA, are nucleic acids. Alongside proteins, lipids and complex carbohydrates, or polysaccharides, nucleic acids are one of the four major types of macromolecules that are essential for all known forms of life. The two DNA strands are known as polynucleotides as they are composed of simpler monomeric units called nucleotides. Each nucleotide is composed of one of four nitrogen-containing nucleobases, cytosine, guanine, adenine or thymine, a sugar called deoxyribose, and a phosphate group. The nucleotides are joined to one another in a chain by covalent bonds, known as the phosphodiester linkage, between the sugar of one nucleotide and the phosphate of the next, resulting in an alternating sugar-phosphate backbone. The nitrogenous bases of the two separate polynucleotide strands are bound together, according to base pairing rules, with T and C with G, with hydrogen bonds to make double-stranded DNA. The complementary nitrogenous bases are divided into two groups, pyrimidines and purines. One thing that scientists discovered when researching DNA is that the DNA molecule contains information. As stated, the information in the DNA provides a set of instructions on how to build that particular body, whether human or animal. It is incredibly complex, and there is no possible way this could have just happened. And, where there is information, which is akin to computer code, common sense tells us that there had to be a programmer who provided the information. Just as matter could not come from nothingness, in the same way, information could not come about as a result of a random act. There has to be a programmer, someone who provided the information contained in the DNA molecule. We would never assume that a book of instructions had just written itself. Yet, that is basically what evolutionists are claiming. That the information in the DNA molecule, millions of times more complex than any book ever written, wrote itself. It is just as absurd to say the DNA code wrote itself as it would be to say a computer program just came together on its own. Do you even realize what an impossibility this would be? On a practical level, what significance does the DNA molecule have pertaining to evolution? Well, first of all, like stated, the DNA molecule is information. Information has to be given by someone who already has the information. If a person is to write a book of instructions, that automatically assumes that the person already had that information and was now putting it into book form. You would have to know your subject and the information pertaining to that subject before you could ever attempt to write something to instruct others. To provide something as complex as the information in the DNA molecule would imply a being with superior knowledge. The person would already have to know how to build a human body. They would have to have prior knowledge before attempting to write it onto paper, or in this case, the molecule itself. Evolutionists claim that evolution occurred as a result of mutations in the DNA molecule. As mutations occurred over the billions of years, as they claim, a species was able to gradually change and mutate into another species. However, in order for this to occur, there must be new information added to the DNA in order to incite the change. However, we have a problem with that theory. Mutations are not a gain of new information. Rather, mutations are a loss of information. We heard of an organization called the Society for the Prevention of Birth Defects. However, we have never heard the Society for the Propagation of Birth Improvements. Why is that? Because mutations are not improvements. Birth defects are a result of a loss of information in the DNA molecule. That alone is enough evidence to prove mutations do not result in a change of species. Another truth that is greatly overlooked is the fact that the DNA information also has rules. It has limitations. The DNA molecule will only allow so much change. It will allow change to a certain point, but then sets a roadblock in the way. It will only allow progression to go so far before it pulls on the reins and prevents any further change. This is called the law of regression. Gregor Mendel performed many experiments on heredity in the 1860s, and one of the results he discovered is the law of regression. To put it simply, the law says that the DNA molecule will only allow so much change before it causes the entity to revert back to its original form. In other words, it places roadblocks that will stop change at a certain point and will allow it to go no further. The DNA molecule will not allow a species to change into another species. The DNA makes it impossible for that to ever happen. Even with closely related species, we see this principle in action. For example, a horse and a donkey can interbreed and produce a mule. However, that mule is sterile and cannot reproduce another mule. A lion and a tiger can interbreed and produce a liger, but again, that liger is sterile and cannot reproduce. Why is that? Because the DNA places limits on change. The DNA makes it completely impossible for one species to mutate into another species. Even with plants, we see the same thing. Today we see a lot of hybrid vegetables being produced. However, the hybrid cannot produce another hybrid. The seeds of the hybrid plant are sterile, are dead, and cannot produce another hybrid plant. Why is that? Because, once again, the DNA has set certain limits in its code that will only allow change to take place to a certain point. So how do we explain evolution in light of the information in the DNA that limits change? Well, the truth is, we can't. There is no way to explain it or even consider evolution as a feasible theory. It is yet another law of science that disproves evolution as a viable hypothesis, much less a theory. So why, in spite of the evidence, do people still cling to the theory of evolution? Because they are afraid to admit there is a holy God who they are accountable to. They do not want to acknowledge that there is a power higher than themselves that requires us to live a certain way. People do not want to change, and admitting that there is a holy God who will punish sin is not a pleasant thought to them. Also, their pride will not allow them to acknowledge God. They want to come across as intellectual, even though the theory of evolution is the direct opposite of intellect. However, they are more concerned about what their peers think of them rather than what God thinks of them. So, rather than submitting to a holy God who has standards they should live by, they toss the concept of God to the curb and go on their merry way. But, unfortunately for them, there are not just present-day consequences of sin, but there are eternal consequences of sin. Those who reject God and reject His gift of salvation through His Son Jesus, will one day hear the words, "Depart from me, you cursed, into everlasting fire, prepared for the devil and his angels." You may think that's just a fairy tale. You may think it's all one big joke. But sadly, one day you will realize it's all too real. You will realize that you will now face the consequences of your sin for all eternity. God has provided a way out. God has provided a way to escape punishment for all eternity. God sent His Son Jesus to pay the penalty for our sin. God took the sin of the entire world and heaped it on Jesus. He became our vicarious sacrifice and was punished in our place. God provides salvation as a free gift. There is absolutely no reason for anybody to go to hell and face eternal punishment, because God has already provided a means of escape. All God asks is that you accept this gift through faith. All He asks is that, instead of trusting in your good deeds or placing any trust in yourself for salvation, you place your trust totally in Jesus' finished work on the cross. Jesus shed His blood for you. Place your trust in that today.